Okay, so let's talk about neurocystic sarcosis today. So, what is neurocystic sarcosis? Neurocystic sarcosis is a result of accidental ingestion of eggs of a worm known as Taenia solium. And what is Taenia solium? Taenia solium is nothing but it is pork tapeworm. So, let's talk about it. So, history. Neurocystic sarcosis is an ancient disease. Hippocrates recognized human tapeworms in early periods, so he knew something is wrong with them. Aristotle compared their appearance to hailstones, and Kuchenmeister in 1855 confirmed that they have larval stages in evolution. Van Beneden demonstrated the cysticerci in pig muscles. That is how we get these worms, because they proliferate in the pig and they are seeded into the pig muscles. Like this is the worm, and when you eat uncooked pork, that is how you get this infestation. Okay. Let's talk about its introduction. So, neurocystic sarcosis is the infection of CNS by larva of Taenia solium. So, it is caused by larva of Taenia solium, which is the pig tapeworm. Neurocystic sarcosis is the most common parasitic disease of nervous system. You have to remember this. The most common parasitic disease of nervous system is neurocystic sarcosis, and it is the leading cause of adult onset epilepsy. Almost 29 to 30% of epilepsy cases in endemic regions worldwide, the cause is neurocystic sarcosis. It is endemic in Central and South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and some regions of Far East, including Indian subcontinent. So these are the areas where you will find most of the cases. Indonesia and China reaching an incidence of 3.6 in some regions where there are pork eating populations. They are prominent over there. The incidence is more over in those places. And a little bit of this thing. If of note, the near absence of infection in Muslim countries where the consumption of pork is forbidden by either religious ethics or where they don't eat pork. It's very uncommon. So these are the high prevalence or endemic areas marked with the dark blue color, and moderate prevalence with a light blue color, and accordingly you can pause the video and you can see. And this is the distribution in India, and very interesting thing is the areas where there are no available reports is marked with the yellow color. These are the areas. This is the area where it is marked with the yellow color, and probably these areas are not consuming pork. That's why these areas are not that much affected with this neurocystic sarcosis. So the scolex is like the head of this tapeworm, and it has hooks, as we have discussed earlier. These all are the hooks marked by the red, and these all are the hooks. And it has a sucker, and then there is neck, and then there is proglottids. All this portion is till its this distal end is proglottids. So as we move from the proximal part of the worm to the distal part of the worm, the maturation of proglottids increases or progresses. What I mean by saying this is, if this is the proximal part of the worm, and as we go to its distal part, the proglottids which are present here are less mature as compared to the proglottids which are present here. Okay. Let's talk about the life cycle of Taenia solium. So the tapeworm life cycle. Let's start from here. Like if a human is infected and he is shedding proglottids in feces. Proglottids. Now the human is shedding the proglottids, and these proglottids in the feces will change into eggs. Because now human is a definitive host of Taenia solium, so proglottids can enter or infect human being again via two different routes. One route is that these proglottids convert into eggs, and these eggs are being ingested by a pig, and they enter the pig in oncosphere, and they hatch and penetrate the intestinal wall of the pig and then circulate to the musculature of the pig. Now this infected pig is being consumed by a human being, and we call it like infected pork. If somebody ingests or takes or consumes or feeds on infected pork or uncooked pork, or you can say raw pork, then after consumption of this pork, the cysticerci will enter the human being and infect a human. The other way of infection is the eggs can enter the human beings via vegetation, or when eggs are shed on some vegetables which are taken from the field and they are not washed in a proper way. So these are the two routes by which it can enter the human beings again, and then in the human being it will enter into the intestine, it will be ingested in, it will go to the intestine, and then accordingly we have three forms, most commonly three forms of infection in the primary host, which is the human being. First is if these Taenia solium infect the brain, then we call it as neurocysticercosis. If they infect the muscles, we call them cysticercosis, and if it is in the intestine, we call it teniasis. Now let's talk about the mode of infection. Now there are three different modes of infection. One is heteroinoculation, in which the eggs from the environment are being digested or ingested by a human being. Let's suppose these are the eggs and these are ingested by a human being. So this is heteroinoculation. Second is internal autoinoculation. Now in internal, we have two different kinds of autoinoculation. One is internal autoinoculation and the second is external autoinoculation. Now what happens in internal autoinoculation is there is regurgitation of the proglottids into the stomach. Basically what happens is, let's suppose this is your small intestine, this is the small intestine, and this is the duodenum, and we have pylorus and we have stomach. I guess I'm doing justice by drawing the stomach, and then we have esophagus, cardia and esophagus. Now what happens is these proglottids, they travel back into the duodenum from the small intestine, and they regurgitate into the stomach. That is how when there is infection in the intestine, because of this regurgitation, so many times because of this regurgitation, there are so many eggs that are being deposited inside the stomach due to regurgitation, and then these enter into the other parts of the body, including muscles. I'll show you the x-rays later on that how widespread this disease can be. Every inch of human muscle of the human body can be infected by this form. I'll show you later on in the x-ray, in X-ray. Now what is external autoinoculation? External autoinoculation is from self, like we can say fecal route. This comes under external autoinoculation. Now let's talk about neuropathology. In neuropathology, we can have asymptomatic viable cysts, we can have dying cysts, we can have calcified cyst, we can have racemose cyst, we can have presentation with meningitis, we can have vasculitis, we can have intraventricular cysts, we can have spinal disease, we can have disseminated disease, and of course we can have hydrocephalus. And in hydrocephalus, we'll also talk about Bruns syndrome. What is Bruns syndrome? This is very interesting and very important syndrome. We'll talk about it later on. Now let's talk about the type of cysts. The first one is Cysticercus cellulosae. Now this Cysticercus cellulosae cyst is a type of cyst which is less virulent, okay, which is very small, less than 2 centimeters. It is round, and the wall of cyst is very thin. It is thin-walled cyst, and it is mostly in the parenchyma or in the subarachnoid space. Mostly the Cysticercus cellulosae cysts are in parenchyma or in subarachnoid space, and they often lead to a silent disease. Most of them are not symptomatic cysts. Then we have Cysticercus racemose type of cysts. These cysts are called racemose type because they appear like a bunch of grapes. So that is why we have racemose name for them. Racemose means bunch of grapes, cluster of grapes. And this refers to presence of multiple cysts without a scolex. This is important to remember. In Cysticercus racemose, there is no scolex. These are multiple cysts without a scolex. And they can also form giant vesicles up to 10 centimeter in diameter with predilection for basal cisterns. So they mostly like to sit in basal cisterns. So they have a predilection for this location in the brain, and they can be up to 10 centimeter in diameter. Then we have certain pathologies which they cause. They can cause cysticercotic arachnoiditis, which is inflammation of the arachnoid. Then they can present as hydrocephalus if they cause a blockage. If they sit on some foramina from where the CSF is draining, they can cause hydrocephalus. They can also infect meninges and cause meningitis. Either they can infect them, or that can be an inflammatory response of the body which can cause meningitis. They can cause strokes, of course, CVAs, by occluding the vessels or by inducing vasculitis. They can cause intense inflammation and seizures. Now, after some slides, we'll talk about seizures. Most of the patients of neurocystic psychosis, the primary presentation, the most common presentation is seizures. Okay, so we have some stages of evolution or stages of involution in which, in the way in which this parasite, Taenia solium or the pig tapeworm, goes through different stages inside the CNS or inside the body. So we have 4 basic stages. Stage 1 is cystic or vesicular stage. Then we have colloidal stage. Then we have granular stage, and then we have calcified stage. And these are in progression, obviously. Now, in cystic or vesicular stage, the parasite is viable. That is, we can see a scolex. The parasite is viable. We can see a scolex. And the host response to this stage or cystic or vesicular stage is downregulation of host immunity. So there is a mild inflammatory reaction. Because of the downregulation of host immunity, there is a mild inflammatory reaction. Now, in second stage, colloidal stage, we have a degenerating scolex. The scolex is there, but it is degenerating. And because of this degeneration, many cytokines are released. There is inflammatory storm in the body, and it leads to severe inflammatory reaction. And because of some inflammatory cytokines and different chemokines that are released, it leads to granuloma formation. Then we have granular stage. In granular stage, the scolex, which was degenerating in colloidal stage, is now degenerated. Scolex is degenerated, and there is astrocytic gliosis that we see in CNS. Then we have calcified stage, which is a calcified nodule. After the scolex has degenerated, the worm has degenerated, and there is intense gliosis around the cyst. There is intense gliosis is a fancy way to say fibrosis around the cyst. This is the calcified cyst, and there is fibrosis around the cyst. Let's talk about the classification. For classification, we have 4 basic classifications. One is anatomical classification. Then we have Sotelo et al. Classification. Then we have Carpio et al. Classification, and then we have Chorobsky classification. Let's talk about the anatomical classification quickly. In anatomical classifications, we have 4 types. One is parenchymal neurocystic sarcosis. Second is ventricular neurocystic sarcosis. Then we have basal meningitis. Then we have mixed forms. We can also classify them anatomically into 2 broad categories. But this we can call as parenchymal disease, and these we can call as extra parenchymal disease, as the name suggests. Okay. In Sotelo et al. Classification, we have active forms and we have inactive forms of neurocystic sarcosis. In active forms of neurocystic sarcosis, we'll come across arachnoiditis, we'll come across parenchymal cysts, we'll come across mass effect due to large cysts or cyst clumps, we'll come across hydrocephalus secondary to meningeal inflammation due to the blockage of CSF outflow. We can come across brain infarction, which can be secondary to vasculitis or strokes or CVA. We can have intraventricular cysts, and we can have spinal cysts. In the inactive forms of neurocystic sarcosis, we can have parenchymal calcifications, and we can have hydrocephalus secondary to meningeal fibrosis, again due to CSF outflow obstruction. In Carpio et al., we have active, we have transitional, and we have inactive. In case of Sotelo classification, we have only active forms and inactive forms of neurocystic sarcosis. In case of Carpio et al., we have active form, we have transitional form, and we have inactive form. So basically, this is showing this classification actually gives us an idea of progression from active to transitional, and transitional to inactive, which obviously will be a calcified form. Now, in active form, we have live, viable parenchymal or extraparenchymal cysts, which rarely produce symptoms. This is very important. In active form, we have rare symptoms. We rarely come across symptoms, apart from the rare instance of mass effect. In transitional form, we can have symptomatic seizures, which occur in this form, and we can have degenerating subarachnoid cysts, which produce meningitis, vasculitis, arachnoiditis, hydrocephalus, ventricular cysts, which can lead to acute or CSF outflow obstruction, causing acute hydrocephalus, which will present as vomiting, headache, altered sensorium, it can present as vertigo, and so on and so on. Inactive form is single or multiple parenchymal calcifications or hydrocephalus, which is secondary to meningeal fibrosis or gliosis. Then we have Chorobsky classification. In Chorobsky classification, we have 3 broad groups. Group 1 is a space occupying intracranial tumor like behaving lesion, which produces focal neurological deficit or manifestations and ultimately raised intracranial tension or intracranial pressure. Surgical implications are exeresis is often indicated. Okay, we have to take out the cyst. In group 2, we have diffuse cerebral syndrome due to numerous cysticerci, leading to cerebral edema, intracranial hypertension, and organic brain syndrome. Exeresis is rarely useful but may be undertaken in life-threatening condition. If it is life-threatening, you take it out, otherwise you manage it conservatively. In group 3, we have basal meningeal or ventricular cysticerci giving rise to hydrocephalus and intracranial hypertension. Rarely focal signs are present and mental disturbances are seen. CSF diversion procedure or something to, we can have a procedure to maintain the CSF flow which has been obstructed, and the patient will improve. Let's talk about the clinical presentations or clinical features. Now, neurocystic sarcosis is a pleomorphic disease. Most symptomatic patients are going to be in from second decade to fourth decade, means 15 to 20 or 20 to 40 years of age, and the disease has no gender or race predilection. Many of the patients, as many as 80% of the patients, are asymptomatic. So you have to diagnose them very precisely. Peak is estimated to occur at 3 to 5 years after infection. It takes 3 to 5 years after the inoculation for the patient to present with symptoms. The onset of symptoms is usually subacute to chronic, with the exception of seizures which present in an acute fashion. Now, cysticerci can be found anywhere in the body, but most importantly, these are found in brain, then CSF. They can be in the subcutaneous tissue, they can be in the skeletal muscle, and or they can be in the eye. So we have brain, we have cerebrospinal fluid, we have skeletal muscle, we have subcutaneous tissue or eye. Physical findings will depend on where the cyst is located in the nervous system. Obviously, in the brain, it is going to depend at in which region of the brain the cysts are present. Accordingly, they will affect and the patient will present. Symptoms are mainly due to mass effect, inflammatory response, or obstruction of foramina and ventricular system of the brain. Obviously, as we talked about, that the ICT is going to be raised because of obstruction of the CSF outflow tracts. So the management is accordingly. Let's talk about parenchymal neurocystic sarcosis. Now, epilepsy is most common presentation. About 70, we already know that 80% of the patients will present in the form of seizures. 70% present with epilepsy. It is the leading cause of adult onset epilepsy. This is very important to know, especially in the endemic areas. Then the epilepsy is we have different kinds of epilepsy or seizure disorders, but in this case, in neurocystic sarcosis, we mostly have simple partial seizures. Then we have generalized tonic-clonic seizures, which are most common more than complex partial seizures. So the risk of seizures in seropositive individuals is 2 to 3 times higher than seronegative controls. Headache, nausea, vomiting is a common presentation. Strokes can occur, which can be like urinary infarcts or hemorrhage. Cause is mostly vascular damage or vasculitis or due to occlusion. If the worm invades or the cyst invades the vessel wall or the intima of the vessel, it can also cause hemorrhage. So it can also present with a hemorrhagic stroke. Frontal lobe involvement, as we talked about, the patient presents to you with different presentations and different clinical features depending on which area of the brain, which part of the brain is affected. So in frontal lobe involvement, we have psychosis, we have dementia, we have Parkinsonism, we can have intellectual impairment, we can have cognitive decline, and so on and so on, and so on and so forth. Cerebellar ataxia can also present if there is a cyst in cerebellum, then it can present as with cerebral signs, or cerebellar ataxia or nystagmus, and so on and so forth. When we can have encephalitis and diffuse brain edema, which is common in children and young females, and then we have risk of developing severe neurological sequelae. Let's talk about the interventricular disease. Interventricular disease in neurocystic sarcosis presents in 5 to 10% cases, and the most common site of obstruction mostly is fourth ventricle. Lateral ventricular cysts are less likely to cause obstruction, and the most common site, again I'll say, is fourth ventricle. The hydrocephalus in interventricular form of the disease presents without the localizing signs. They present without the localizing signs. Now, what is Brunn's syndrome? This is what I was trying to tell you earlier. Now, Brunn's syndrome is a syndrome which is caused by obstruction, which then leads to CSF outflow obstruction and causes nausea, vomiting, and vertigo. It is because of unattached cysts which may cause sudden positional mechanical obstruction of CSF outflow tracts. This is important. Let's talk about meningeal cysts. Meningeal irritation signs or signs of meningitis can be present in the patient if the patient has meningeal cysts. Then raised ICT from inflammation and edema can also be seen. Intracranial hypertension because of obstruction of CSF flow by basal or ventricular cysticercosis. Remember, basal is more common. May also be due to large cysts displacing midline structures and granular epidermitis, aconitis, and so-called cysticercotic encephalitis. Hence, the name comes from this. It is caused mostly by the inflammatory response to massive infestation of cerebral parenchyma by the cysticerci. Now, patients may have seizures and deterioration of their mental status due to post-inflammatory response. There can be neuropsychiatric disturbances also, which can be partly related to the raised intracranial hypertension. Hydrocephalus is present in 10 to 30% of the patients, and communicating hydrocephalus is due to inflammatory fibrosis of the arachnoid villi and the inflammatory reaction of the meninges, and because of this there is subsequent fibrosis leading to occlusion of the foramina of Luschka and Magendie. Non-communicating hydrocephalus may be due to interventricular cysts, as we have talked about Bruns syndrome. Presentations in other forms of neurocysticercosis can be intracellular or spinal neurocysticercosis. Spinal form is a rare form, and thoracic, among spinal thoracic lesions are most common. Extramedullary form is most frequent and responsible for symptoms of spinal dysfunction such as radicular pain. Now we know the extramedullary lesions will always present with radicular pain, weakness, and paresthesias, whereas intramedullary lesions can present as paraparesis, sensory deficits with the level and sphincter disturbances. Ocular cysticercosis is seen in 1 to 3% of the patients. Most commonly, it is in the subretinal space. This is something to be remembered. Subretinal space. Patients may present with decreased visual acuity, visual field defects, and monocular blindness. One thing we'll talk about in the treatment is that if you have a patient of neurocysticercosis, you always get a fundus exam. You always get a fundus exam or opthal consult, because if you see a worm or a cyst in the eye, then you do not treat the patient. Else, because of the inflammatory response, what is going to happen is the patient is going to lose vision. So this is very important. This is very, very important, because of the inflammatory response. When the worm is getting killed, you're going to lose the patient's vision, because it will because the inflammatory cytokines in the inflammatory storm will destroy the retina. It is going to injure the retina so badly that the patient will get blind. So this is very important to know. And clinically also, you can be sued by the patient. So let's talk about systemic cysticercosis. Systemic cysticercosis is very commonly seen in Asian continent, where the pork is consumed in huge quantities. The parasites may be located in the subcutaneous tissue or the muscle. We have talked earlier also. Peripheral nerve involvement can also be seen, and there can also be involvement of liver, spleen as well. As we talked about, this cysticercosis can infect any tapeworm, can infect any part of the body. Okay, so for investigations for labs, let's talk about the labs. We have peripheral eosinophilia because of the immune response, and we have raised Ig levels. And in immunologic testing, we have ELISA, which is the antibody detection. We can do it in CSF, which is more reliable than serum. It is most widely used test of CSF in case of neurocysticercosis. It is 87% sensitive and 95% specific. So a very good test to do. It also is used for serum antibody detection, but it is more specific for CSF more than serum. Enzyme-linked immunotransfer blot, immunoelectrotransfer blot assay, which is called EITB. Now, EITB is the test of choice for detecting cysticercal antibodies. The test is 95% sensitive and 100% specific. This test, EITB, uses the affinity of purified glycoprotein antigens, and it is always superior to ELISA and PCR. Okay, so this is the test of choice. Now, serum testing is more sensitive than CSF, contrary to ELISA, in which we have CSF more than serum. In this EITB, we have serum testing more sensitive than CSF. There are some disadvantages of enzyme-linked immunoelectrotransfer blot. These are false negative tests are up to 50%, and especially with the single cerebral cyst or in those patients which have calcified cysts. They can be positive in patients who are exposed to adult parasite without developing cysticercosis. So these are the two limitations or disadvantages of this enzyme linked immunotransfer plot, or EATB. Now we can also do CSF analysis. CSF analysis is indicated in every patient with a solitary brain lesion. This is very important to remember. If the patient presents to you with a solitary brain lesion, you always go for CSF analysis. It is insensitive and non-specific in diagnosis of cysticercosis. Contraindications are LAS cyst causing severe edema and displacement of brain structures, obstructive hydrocephalus. We know when there is raised ICT, we mostly avoid getting a lumbar puncture. So it is not done, or either it is done in a guided way if there are no alternatives. That is called a guided tap, but we mostly don't do it because it will lead to brain herniation. So results are normal brain parenchymal lesions abnormal are seen in 50 to 80% of the case in basal cisterns or ventricular lesions. CSF findings in case of neurocysticercosis are mononuclear pleocytosis, which usually will not exceed 200 to 300 cells per millimeter cube. Normal glucose levels, elevated proteins can be up to 50 to 200 milligrams per deciliter. We have eosinophilia, we have raised immunoglobulins, IgG index is raised, we have oligoclonal bands in some patients. Let's talk about stool examination. Stool examination in TNSS can be established, and it is a very good test to detect tinea sodium X and proglottids in patients' stools. Now, teniasis and neurocysticercosis coexist in up to 15% of the patients with neurocysticercosis. So this is very important. The intestinal form, which is the teniasis, and neurocysticercosis can coexist. Both of these forms can be present in 10 to 15% of the patients with neurocysticercosis. Intestinal teniasis is very common in patients with massive infestation with cysticerci, but without cysticercotic encephalitis. Okay, intestinal teniasis is very common in patients with massive infestations with cysticerci, but without cysticercotic encephalitis. It is not always a rule that the cysticerci will involve the brain parenchyma and they will cause neurocysticercosis. They can only be presenting as intestinal teniasis. Tapeworm carriers may be identified by examining the stools of the relatives of the patient with cysticercosis encephalitis. This is a very nice X-ray image which shows multiple worms. I will spot them, so many of them, all disseminated. This is a disseminated disease. All of them everywhere in the soft tissue, in the muscles, in the soft tissue. When we talk about now, how come the patient has so many cysticerci? This is the main cause of so many cysticerci or so many tapeworms is the regurgitation. We talked about that from small intestine, the proglottids get regurgitated into the stomach and then they proliferate. This is the most common cause why the patient presents with such a disseminated disease. CT scan, it is a preferred imaging study for detection of parenchymal calcifications, because you know CT or X-ray. CT uses X-ray and it detects calcium. Calcifications are very nicely detected on CT. Now we have staging according to the CT picture of the brain parenchyma. We have again the four same stages: vesicular stage, then we have colloidal stage, then we have granular stage, and then we have calcified stage. In vesicular stage, the cyst wall is non-enhancing, well-defined membrane. It has a well-defined membrane. It is a well-defined membrane. It is non-enhancing, and the Weibel scolex is visible as a hole with dot appearance. Suggestive of Weibel larva. Colloidal stage is ring enhancing is there with perilesional edema. In colloidal stage, we have ring enhancement and perilesional edema, and we have degenerating scolex. Fluid becomes more turbid. Earliest stage in cyst involution is the colloidal stage, and it is the stage of larval degeneration. Then we have granular stage. We have focal nodular enhancing necrotic lesion with perilesional edema, and we have a degenerating scolex. In colloidal stage, the scolex was degenerating. Now it has degenerated already in granular stage, and now after its degeneration has complete, or it is just going to complete, we have eosinophilic structure. Bladder and scolex are in various stages of disintegration. They are being dismantled. Now from colloidal stage, after granular stage, we have calcified stage. It presents as small hyperdense nodules without perilesional edema. Calcific stage or calcified stage is without perilesional edema. So we have a lesion over here. This is the CT scan of the patient. The bone appears white. Remember the rule. It is the vesicular stage. This is the colloidal stage, and it is post-contrast ring enhancement of multiple lesions. Multiple lesions. See, so many of them. Then we have CT granular stage. This is the lesion. This is the lesion. Then we have CT calcified stage. You can see multiple calcifications, small calcifications, small calcifications everywhere. This is the calcified stage. It has no perilesional edema. You can see very clear. It has no perilesional edema. So we're going to talk about MRI, biopsy, and other investigations along with the treatment in the next coming video. Thanks for watching. Do watch the next video.